Wake up. Ban miss just happened. It's December 16th at 12:09 p.m. in Eastern Time. My name is Matt Chow. The Legacy Banned and Restricted update just happened about an hour ago for me. Looks like Psychic Frog and Vexing Bauble were both banned in Legacy. There were a bunch of changes in Modern and some other formats, but Legacy is what I want to focus on here. So let's look at the actual announcement that they made and then compare it with the data just so that we have a more full picture than what WotC published. So they announced that based on the dominance of Dimir Reanimator, they had already banned Grief, but that didn't successfully curb how powerful Dimir Reanimator was. So we can see that based on the numbers that we have from the last 3 Eternal Weekends, where Psychic Frog was a big part of the metagame, overall it was about 30% of this metagame. It had pretty strong win rates, but not oppressive win rates on its own. Put up about 52% sort of averaged out across the 3 Eternal Weekends. So the card was highly played in about a third of all decks, and it put up a positive win rate across all of those decks. As we look at the sort of reasoning that they made this decision, Psychic Frog obviously goes really well into the hybrid tempo reanimator strategy that we've seen in Dimir Reanimator. It's both a Dreadhorde Arcanist or Ragavan type effect, where it's extremely potent on its own when backed up by Daze and removal spells in Wasteland, in terms of it being able to snowball and win a game all on its own, but it also has the added benefit of being able to discard the large creatures like Gristlebrand or Atraxa or Archon of Cruelty. So it has additional synergy in this type of strategy that a card like Dreadhorde Arcanist or Ragavan wouldn't. So this is sort of what they were talking about when they're talking about how the power of Psychic Frog forces Reanimator decks to coalesce into the Dimir shell. They also talk about how it's the same sort of phenomenon in the blue-black tempo decks. They call them Dimir Murktide decks. And so Psychic Frog, because it's in that same line of cards as something like a Dreadhorde Arcanist or a Ragavan, it disincentivizes playing less stable mana bases in favor of a slightly more consistent 2-color mana base, where there isn't really any reason to be splashing for red or green or white, as they say. We actually see this in the numbers with Grixis Delver, where Grixis Delver was a huge deck prior to the printing of Psychic Frog, and then once Psychic Frog was printed, the play rate and the win rate of Grixis Delver plummeted. And enough to the point where we actually just don't even see Delver itself in very many decks anymore. So that's why they decided to ban Psychic Frog. I think that makes sense. I'm on record saying that I think Psychic Frog should have been banned, but ultimately, it was a card that was maybe a little bit too pushed in terms of its ability to snowball. So we've been looking at the Psychic Frog numbers as a whole, but I'd also like to look at the Psychic Frog numbers based on the decks that they were actually included in. So let's take a look at the performance of Dimir Reanimator across all 3 Eternal Weekends and how it's stacked up against the field, because its numbers are going to be different from every deck that played Psychic Frog. Oh, I missed this slide. Oops. So in addition to discussing Psychic Frog, they also talked about the other options in terms of things that they could hit in terms of trying to bring Dimir Reanimator down a notch and increase the variations or options available to Reanimator decks. Not in terms of adding more options, but in terms of removing the incentive to only play the one color combination. So traditionally, Reanimator has had several different variants, including things like Tin Fins, World Gorger, Black Red. There's a lot of different options, and so they decided not to hit Entomb or Reanimate because that doesn't necessarily impact the fact that Psychic Frog is the big draw to specifically Dimir. But back to where I was jumping ahead to, Dimir Reanimator itself, these are the numbers that it put up across the combined Eternal Weekends and each of them side by side. So overall, it was very highly played in Japan, and then slightly less played in North America and Europe. Overall, 13.5% of the fields across the three events were Dimir Reanimator. This is the way that I was defining it at the time was it's a Wasteland, Daze, Entomb, Troll of Khazad-dûm deck that has like some big things to target and reanimate while also being able to play a fair game to apply pressure on multiple angles. The win rate of this deck was very high, so overall it hit almost a 55% win rate. It had the best showing in Japan at a 57% win rate, the worst showing in North America, still at only just shy of 52%, and then it had a 56% win rate in Europe. The matchup spread was generally pretty positive for the deck as a whole. It went slightly favored against Dimir Tempo, but very, very slightly, like it's basically a coin flip. And then it was slightly unfavored in some situations against some of the Nadu decks and against Eldrazi. And then it was either very good or very bad against Mystic Forge, depending on the tournament. I think that Kelvin Wallace, being the person who won Eternal Weekend North America and had a testing team of people all playing Mystic Forge, that tournament probably had an outsized number of very high skilled Mystic Forge players compared to the other Eternal Weekends. So that's how Dimir Reanimator did, one of the primary Psychic Frog decks. But they also talked about in their announcement the Dimir Tempo decks, or they called them Dimir Murktide. So this is the other big Psychic Frog deck. Overall, it made up about 7% of the field, with a range between 8% in Japan and 6% in Europe. Overall, its win rate was a lot more modest. It was about 51.5 overall, with a range between 50%, so basically a coin flip in North America, all the way up to 53.5% win rate in Europe. It had, again, I already mentioned the sort of coin flip matchup against Dimir Reanimator. It went it went very unfavored against Bant Nadu, the mid-rangey version of the Nadu decks with Force of Will. It was positive against the Mystic Forge combo decks, positive against Cephalid Breakfast, and then negative against Nadu Elves. So basically, the combo decks that have a really good mid-range game were good against it, and then it was much better against the sort of more fragile all-in combo decks. Let's move on to Vexing Bauble and the reasons that they decided to ban Vexing Bauble. So they talk about how they have a pillar of the format in Legacy, which is free counter magic. Think things like Force of Will, Daze, Force of Negation, and that this is an important component for Legacy as a format in their view. The relative ease of being able to put Vexing Bauble into your deck is pretty low. You can basically just you put it in your main deck, you cast it. If it's not relevant in the game, then you sacrifice it and you draw a card, and you've basically spent 2 mana to cycle 1, and that is or cycle to draw a card, and that is it's mana inefficient, but it's not a super high opportunity cost compared to something like Veil of Summer, where if it's not good in a matchup, then there is no way to cash it in. And so you end up with this card that you can spend a mana to get it out of your hand, but you may not be able to replace itself. And so then you ended up down one card for something that had no effect. In terms of how well Vexing Bauble did and its play rate, it wasn't played as much as Psychic Frog is, but it still put up a combined total of the metagame of just above 25% or a quarter. It was the least played in Japan, and then that play rate increased. So North America went up to 26, 27%, and then Europe was 27.5%. This win rate is a lot lower though, so it basically had about an even 50% across the board. It's a 0.5% in either direction, positive or negative. And I think that a big part of this is that it's a less deck defining card than Psychic Frog is. So Vexing Bauble is a very free card to play. It doesn't require that many deck building constraints apart from anti-synergy with free counterspells if you're trying to play both. But it can be put in basically anything, and you can also put just a single copy in a deck like Painter, which they mention, because of Urza's Saga. So you can just put a single one in, and then you can tutor it if it's necessary. If not, and so it can be very high impact, but it's also probably played in a lot wider range of decks, and so there are going to be some bad decks included in that data. But you could also look at this data and say, oh, well, it didn't even do that well, so why did we care about the win rate? Or like, why do we care about banning it? The next thing that they so they addressed this, which is then that it had a really high win rate amongst a couple of decks. So basically, the top of the Vexing Bauble decks did very well, and so that was the thing that became concerning for them. They banned it because of these decks, basically. So Mystic Forge was the breakout deck of Eternal Weekend North America. It didn't make up a huge portion of the metagame, but it was increasing and probably would have continued to increase in metagame share depending on how quickly or how effectively people were able to combat this deck. But we'll never know. That's going to be a hypothetical universe for us. So overall, just about under 4% of the metagame once we sort of average it out, but under 2% in Japan, jumped up to 3.5% in North America, and then 5% of the field in Europe. But it had an insane win rate. So it had a 60% win rate in Japan, a 60 and a half, like within the range. So basically 60% win rate in Japan, 60% in North America, and then it dropped down to a 54.5% win rate. But if you had an archetype that was at a 54% win rate overall, that would still be very, very high. We do see that it didn't do so well against some of the other top decks that are being discussed. So I already touched on the Dimir reanimator piece of this, where I think that the result in North America is very it looks like an outlier when you look at this data, but there's a reason for it, which is that the team that played Mystic Forge in North America was extremely good. The Bant Nadu matchup, again, it looks like it was relatively positive with the exception of Europe, so it is also possible that in Europe, the Bant Nadu players included additional sideboard cards or learned how to play against the deck in preparation for that tournament. Nadu Elves had a really small sample size, so we don't necessarily know there, but it looks like Nadu Elves was quite good against Mystic Forge, so that is something that, had this metagame continued to evolve without bannings, we might have seen a natural predator for this deck emerge. Against Dimir Tempo, we already talked about this as well. It overall did poorly. Dimir Tempo is great against combo decks. It crushed Eldrazi, though, so they're both playing on a similar axis, but the Mystic Forge combo is able to create one-turn kills and have extremely powerful single turns, rebuild from very few resources, and so Eldrazi has like a much more consistent sort of like kill, I would suppose, but it's it's not really fast enough to race something like Mystic Forge. If we look at Eldrazi itself, so Eldrazi was one of the best decks against Dimir Reanimator by the looks of it. Overall, about 6% of the field, but decreased in play rate over the course of the 3 Eternal Weekends, but did put up positive but not excessive win rates, with the exception of Japan, had a very strong result. It had a good matchup against Dimir Reanimator, but then didn't have great matchups against most of the field. So against the highly disruptive Dimir Tempo, against the very fast Mystic Forge combo, and against Nadu Elves, which is a deck that doesn't necessarily care about much of the interaction that Eldrazi can present, it wasn't able to do very well. So I think these are the two decks that they were looking at when they looked at the sort of like prevalence and success of Vexing Bauble, not necessarily the inclusion of Vexing Bauble in something like Painter or some of the white Stompy lists, or I mean, they also may have been looking at Moon Stompy, but Moon Stompy didn't perform very well over these events. Let's look at the sort of last thing that they mention in the article. So they mentioned that Nadu is also something that they're keeping an eye on. So Nadu was the other big card of the Eternal Weekends this fall, and so they are keeping an eye on Nadu, basically with the power vacuum of Psychic Frog and Vexing Bauble being removed from the format. They're worried that Nadu may be sort of it might become the deck to beat. It might be too powerful. So overall, it was played. It wasn't as popular in Japan, but then increased in play rate significantly to 9 and 11% in North America and Europe, averaged out to about 8.5% of the field, and put up a very impressive, roughly 55% win rate across the board, 54 and a quarter, with a 56, almost 57% win rate in Japan, a 53.5% win rate in North America, and then a 54% win rate in Europe. I think that it was probably the most successful of the three cards that we're discussing here, but it is also the least flexible. So there are essentially only three decks that can play Nadu, which are the Bant Nadu deck. So that's a like Green Sun Zenith, Force of Will, Nadu, some elves, and some like Nomad's Encore so that they can go really big. But it's sort of like a mid-range deck with a combo element. And then there is Nadu Elves, which is closer to being like an old school Elves list with Natural Order, Court of Calling, Green Sun Zenith, no cantrips, no Force of Will. And so it's a creature deck with the ability to combo in one of two ways or to play a beatdown game. And then, of course, Cephalid Breakfast, which is a combo deck which includes Nadu as an additional copy of Cephalid Illusionist, where it's otherwise already playing all of the enablers for Cephalid Illusionist that combo with Nadu as well. So let's look at each of those decks and see how they do, and then whether or not WotC's sort of concern is, I think, valid. So if we look at Nadu Elves, this was the most performant of the Nadu decks. It had an overall non-mirror win rate of 62.33%, but it was a very small percentage of the metagame. So as it grows and as it becomes more developed and as players play against it more, we may see some changes in these win rates as people are able to learn how to combat it effectively. It only was about 1.25% of the metagame overall, with most of that being pulled up in the average by Europe, where it was only like a tenth, like it was a six. It was 0.16% of the metagame in Japan. It was 0.5% of the metagame in North America, and then 3% in Europe. We see the win rates here 50% in Japan, and then 64% in North America, and 62.5% in Europe, which are very impressive win rates. And it seemed to have a very strong win rate against basically all of the other top decks, but it's really important to remember that these are very small sample sizes. It's like approximately 40 matches played against Dimir reanimator, a total of 11 matches played against Bant Nadu, 22 matches played against Mystic Forge, 18 against Dimir Tempo, and 15 matches against Eldrazi. And so all of these are small sample sizes which exaggerate any differences in win rates. Looking at Bant Nadu, this deck also did pretty well, was a larger percentage of the metagame, 4% of the metagame, and then had a win rate of, once averaged out, 53% win rate, 60% in Japan, 53.5% in North America, and then under 50% in Europe, but only slightly unfavored in Europe, so 49.5% in Europe. And it's got a spread, like a different spread, so it seemed like it was middling against Cephalid Breakfast and went a couple of different ways against Dimir reanimator, also against Mystic Forge. This one's a little bit hard to tell when you're trying to like tease out the details. The only one of these that I think has a large enough differential to feel confident about was its matchup against Eldrazi, where it was not good against Eldrazi. Everything else, sample size is probably too small or too close. The last of the Nadu decks would have been Cephalid Breakfast. So Cephalid Breakfast is probably the fastest, but also the most fragile of these decks that can be combated in a multitude of different ways through graveyard hate, through spot removal, and so it is the most consistently fast, I would say, but also the easiest of them to disrupt. That said, when a really strong player is playing this deck, it can be very difficult to play against. So it's a high skill deck, I would say. The metagame share of this deck was under 4%, 3.33%, with its most popular showing in North America. Its overall win rate was sort of similar to Dimir Reanimator overall, where it was 52 to 53% of the win rates. It looked, again, like these are small sample sizes, and there was a lot of differences between tournaments. So it went negative against Dimir Reanimator in Japan, but positive in North America, and then negative again in Europe. And so, what can you really draw from that? It's hard to say. Overall, though, negative against Dimir Tempo, where the high level of disruption was something that it was able to had a very hard time combating. So overall, what do we take away from this? I think that Wizards is taking a sort of minor changes, sort of status quo perspective to how they want to approach the ban list. They're protecting cards that are they're identifying sort of pillars of the format, and those pillars of the format tend to be the sort of like older, more iconic cards. Think Force of Will, think Reanimate, think Entomb. And so they're basically trying to balance gameplay enjoyability with the ability for players to continue to play those cards. And so if a card or a deck is preventing people from playing a diversity of different decks, or the ability for those sort of iconic cards to be played, that is where it seems like they're leading here. I've got some much sort of like broader thoughts about the BNR in general and how the different approaches and sort of like values that we each have as players can lead us to advocate for different cards getting hit or not hit, but that it's less about, is a card super dominant or does it lead to unfun play patterns, and more about what is it that each of us want Legacy to look like, and then how do we sort of like make the argument that our vision is the one that is correct. And so that can be, there's a vast ranges of different possible outcomes that we're looking for, but which outcome you want will also impact what cards you think should be banned or unbanned. I don't know. Let me know what you think. I hope that you enjoyed spending this time with me. I have to go to work now, so I'll enjoy that, hopefully. And you enjoy the rest of your Monday or whatever day it is that you're watching. Thank you so much, and have a great rest of your day.